Welcome back. New reporting from Bloomberg reveals the White House could try to block some of Robert Mueller's final report to prevent it from being shared with Congress and the wider public once it's been completed. Shannon Pettypiece, a frequent guest of ours and one half of a byline tonight, reporting that Mueller may submit his findings to the DOJ as early as February. More on that in a minute. And, quote, Democrats who now control the House have said they'll demand that the department hand over the report and that they intend to make it public. The White House may counter by asserting, you guessed it, executive privilege to prevent key findings from being turned over. President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, spoke to Fox News after the Bloomberg piece was published this morning. He said, quote, we prefer that as much of the report as possible is public. We believe a selective release would be problematic, but Giuliani did not rule out the White House invoking executive privilege, saying further, and we quote, we will enter that review process with no preconceptions about blocking material, but until our team reviews the report, we cannot waive executive privilege. Well, here to talk about all of it is our friend Maya Wiley, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, these days a professor at the New School. Counselor, I have a number of questions for you. First of all, the calendar. When you hear that month, February, in a report, do you put much stock in that? There's a lot that you and I have discussed night after night here that hasn't happened yet among the realm of the expected things in the Mueller investigation.
It's very difficult to know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. You knew I was going to say it because it's true. And the reason it's true is because we don't know all that Robert Mueller knows, right? And we don't know it. What we do know is that there are criminal investigations. We don't know what they're about. They were in the Michael Flynn sentencing memo where he said, thankfully, Flynn cooperated quite well, had deep knowledge in history, into relationships with Russia, said that quite explicitly, but also said that there were 2 other criminal investigations, lots of redaction. We don't know what it's about, right? So what we can imagine is, can Robert Mueller give a partial reporting if he chooses to on some aspects? He could. It's certainly within his purview to decide to do that. Would he? I don't know. I don't know how he would necessarily benefit from doing that, particularly in the political climate he's been forced to operate in. But who knows?
But I'm just a guy here. I'm not a former Fed like you. I hear that the Mueller grand jury's been extended for 6 months. That gets my attention. That is an indicator that we're not done with you folks yet, and we got some more work.
That's right. I mean, we knew that he wasn't done by the sentencing memos. Like I said, Michael Flynn, I'm going to go back to Michael Flynn because I think that sentencing memo, even though it seems like a long time ago now, was not very long ago. Michael Flynn is not going to be sentenced before March. He's got to do an update on that. But we know that there are investigations. Even in the reporting over the last month, we've seen new indications that of contact between Paul Manafort and, of course, a former Russian arms dealer who there's that. I mean, we know that he's saying Manafort did not fully cooperate, and we're going to have filings about that. But it really is the fact that there are investigations that are criminal in nature and that are redacted in documents that have been filed before the court. And we also know that he's fighting about documents and evidence from Company A, which is controlled by a foreign government that is fighting him on delivering those documents.
We have about 60 seconds remaining. If you switch teams and the president hired you and said, look, there's stuff in this Mueller stuff I don't want out, how tough an argument is it to make executive privilege arguments?
It's ridiculously tough. And what I would say is, thanks, I have a job. So you can't hide behind an attorney, slink behind counsel to avoid scandal. The reality here is that we have the Richard Nixon case in which Richard Nixon said, executive privilege, I don't have to turn over these tapes. And the Supreme Court said, well, yes, you do. The strongest argument you could make for executive privilege is if, say, you had a national security concern. In this instance, the investigation itself is about whether or not we have to have national security concerns, including about the behavior potentially of the United States president. I think it's a tough one.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.